Hi everyone! One of the most popular candidates today for the true location of Atlantis is the Eye of the Sahara. So this is a geological formation in Mauritania in northwest Africa. So this, according to some people, particularly the channel Bright Insight, is a perfect match for the descriptions of Atlantis found in Plato's writings. So I have looked at some of the elements of this theory in the past, in two previous videos actually, looking at the idea that ancient maps show that Atlantis was there, and also the idea that this area was said to have been ruled by a king called Atlas, just like Atlantis. So I've looked at those two elements before, but in this video we're going to take a look at the supposed geological match. So according to Bright Insight and other people who support the theory, the Eye of the Sahara matches pretty much perfectly with the descriptions, the measurements given by Plato. So according to Plato, the metropolis of Atlantis was composed of a central island with 3 surrounding rings of land, each ring divided by a section of water. So there were these concentric rings of alternating land and water surrounding a central island. Now the Eye of the Sahara doesn't have any water in it, obviously. According to proponents of this theory, it did have water in it in the past. That used to be where the sea level was. So it was filled with water and surrounded by water. That's the idea. I'll have a look at that idea in a future video, but let's just go with it for now. Let's suppose that it was filled with water. So how well does it match? Well, yes, there is a central island, as it were, and it is surrounded by 3 concentric ridges, which would have been rings of land in between areas of water if the sea level was really there. So at first glance that looks like it matches, and there's also the fact that Plato mentions that there was a passage through the rings of land to the central island, and Bright Insight points out that the outermost ring of land surrounding the Eye of the Sahara does indeed have a gap in it, so that would appear to match the passage that Plato referred to. And then there's also the factor of the measurements. So Plato tells us that the diameter of Atlantis, the metropolis of Atlantis, was 100 stadia. He refers to the island in the center being 50 stadia from the sea being outside the outermost ring of land. So if it was 50 stadia from the sea, and that was the central island, then the diameter would be about 100 stadia, which is about 18.5 kilometers. Now that's interesting because when we look at the measurements of the Eye of the Sahara, we take the central island and 2 surrounding rings, which is the core part of the structure, you could say. It's about 20 or 21 kilometers, depending on how exactly you measure it. But we can see it's a reasonably good fit for Plato's descriptions. It's not exactly what Plato said, but it's decently close. And then there's also the fact that Plato describes a massive plain in the center of Atlantis. So next to the Eye of the Sahara, there is supposedly this big rectangular plain, which is just like what Plato described. He referred to Atlantis having this big rectangular plain. So that is another feature which supposedly matches between Atlantis and the Eye of the Sahara. And another geographical feature is the fact that Atlantis was said to have had mountains to the north. Now when we look on a map and we look at the Eye of the Sahara, we see that there are indeed mountains to the north, or rather the northwest, of the Eye of the Sahara. So that is another supposed match between the Eye of the Sahara and what Plato wrote. So from these general descriptions and the measurements given, there is supposedly a perfect correspondence between the Eye of the Sahara and Atlantis. We've got the rings of land, the measurements, the passage through the rings of land, the plain, and finally the mountains to the north. But when we look a bit more closely, we can see that these pieces of evidence don't actually stand up to scrutiny. They're based a lot on cherry picking and just ignoring the things that don't work or misrepresenting the facts. So, for example, the rings of land and the measurements and the passage and everything. So the problem is that these pieces of evidence are actually mutually exclusive. So, okay, let's take the rings of land. So yes, Plato describes 3 rings of land surrounding a central island, which is visually what we see with the Eye of the Sahara. However, if you take the 3 rings of land to match Plato's description, then the measurements don't work. I don't know if you noticed, but when I was describing the thing about the measurements, I mentioned just 2 rings of land. Because that's the thing, to make the measurements work, you have to take just 2 rings of land, not the 3rd. If you include the third ring of land, then the diameter is about twice as much as what Plato actually described. So if you take just the central island, as it were, surrounded by two rings of land, then yes, that's about 20 or 21 kilometers, which is similar to the 18.5 kilometers that Plato indicates. But you have to ignore the third ring of land. If you take in the third ring of land, then it's over 40 kilometers wide, which is, like I said, more than double what Plato actually described. But if you ignore the third ring of land, then it doesn't match the number of rings that Plato describes. Another similar issue is with the passage. Plato describes a passage going through the rings of land from the sea to the central island, whereas the passage that Bright Insight points out only goes through the third ring of land. It's a gap in the third ring of land. It doesn't go through the other two right to the central island. So again, if you include the third ring of land to make the number of rings work and to incorporate the passage, you have to completely ignore the measurements given by Plato, and also it still doesn't fit the fact that the passage was said to have gone through all three rings of land. If you ignore the third ring to make the measurements fit, then the number of rings don't fit and there's no passage at all. So these pieces of evidence that are used are completely mutually contradictory, they're mutually exclusive. And then regarding the plain, it's simply not true that there's a distinct large rectangular plain next to the Eye of the Sahara. In fact, if you look on a map, you can see there's a plain in as much as it's in the middle of a desert. So obviously there are desert plains all around it, but there's no single clearly defined rectangular plain like Plato describes. He describes a specific rectangular plain surrounded by mountains. There is nothing like that next to the Eye of the Sahara. There is simply a plain in as much as there's open land next to it, but that's all. And as for the mountains, well, yes, okay, that's true. There are mountains to the north, but they're actually to the northwest. So if we include mountains to the northwest, then obviously we could potentially have included mountains that were to the northeast. If you accept mountains to the northwest as being valid, and I'm not saying that they're not, but the point is that that would also mean that mountains to the northeast would have been valid as well as mountains directly to the north. The point is, it's basically a 50% chance that this would match if there are mountains anywhere in the area. As long as they're more northerly than southerly, they could be viewed as being to the north. So there's basically about a 50% chance that this would match. So it matches, yes, but it is not anywhere near a specific detail. It cannot be considered to be a specific detail that's in any way a weighty piece of evidence that this is the Eye of the Sahara. You can find things which had mountains vaguely to the north pretty much anywhere on Earth. It's not a specific detail. So that's really the problem. This evidence is all vague and contradictory. It's all mutually exclusive. There is no passage that goes through the three rings of land from outside to the central island. There is no clearly defined plain next to it with mountains surrounding it. There is no match between the measurements given by Plato and the measurements of the Eye of the Sahara. There are, of course, some similarities, but nothing more significant than various other places that have vague similarities to Atlantis. Now, of course, you could excuse some of these mistakes by saying, well, it's just a result of the great passage of time between when the events happened and when Plato wrote it down. Like, for example, you could use that as an excuse for why the measurements don't really match, or why the passage only goes through the outer ring rather than all three rings as Plato described. You could, of course, make this claim. You could give this excuse that it's just because of corruptions that have crept in over time. Of course, you could, but the point is that there isn't a match. What we have doesn't match. There is a plausible explanation for why it doesn't match. It's because it happened so long ago. Sure, but you could use the same excuse to make any other location fit as well. The point is, we have to stop saying that the Eye of the Sahara perfectly matches Plato's description, because it just doesn't. So in future videos, I'll have a look at more pieces of evidence, like the supposed destruction, the supposed evidence of civilization there, the question of whether or not the sea level ever really was at that level in Africa. So I'll have a look at all those in the future, but for now, we can see there is no match, no significant, substantial, important match between the Eye of the Sahara and Plato's description of Atlantis. Now, if you'd like to know about my theories on the historical events behind the earliest Welsh tale about King Arthur, then come back next time for my next video.